So hi, we're here to introduce Sam, and yeah, I'm just going to kind of preface this with a mistake that I made last night. So me and Vincent were up pretty late working on the intro, and we were like, getting really good ideas, and we're going to make really embarrassing jokes about Sam. And then I send it to who I think is Vincent. Like, hey Vincent, here's a presentation. And then I wake up this morning and it's like, hey man, great intro. I really like that. Could you add a little bit more about poisonous animals and blah blah blah. And so I had sent it to Sam. And Sam had thought I sent it to him for revision, and he had all these ideas. But screw you, Sam, we're not changing it.
Alright, so Sam. So last semester, Sam and I actually had all of our classes together, and our classmates actually started to notice that his personality and my personality were starting to morph together, and like we were kind of the similar person. And so I was like, okay, that's pretty funny. But then after I started to find out a little bit about his history, I thought maybe that wasn't the best thing for me. Before Sam came to us with 4 publications, he, like Corlecky, started out in Minnesota. And like any good Minnesotan, like Paul Bunyan, Prince, Corlecky, Sam has a really interesting life trajectory to get where he is right now. And so he actually told me last semester that he was employed in high school at a video store. And he said he was really good at his job. And so then now the other thing too about the video store is that he later found out that it's actually a part of the Filipino mafia. And so and he told me that he got really good at his job. And so, so I really imagine that he means that he got really good at things like the clientele, who paid late fees, laundering money from like the rival Blockbuster, things like that. Running Ponzi schemes to get a hold of DVDs really early or something like that. Normal Filipino mafia kind of things that you do in a video store. But one day he decided that he needed to change his life. And I mean, I would imagine that it gets really boring when all your customers are dead, and VHS has gone the way of like floppy disks and things like that. And so he decided to move away and pursue his dream of becoming a biker.
And this is the story of the bike ferry. A bike ferry is pretty self-explanatory. And basically what Sam wanted to do is he wanted to become a bike ferry, right? And where do you do that best? You become a bike ferry in Bike Fairyland, Vermont. So he moved to Vermont, and he wanted to get some really practical skills, to be rich, be a good bike ferry, and so he ended up going to college to study the arts of the bike ferry. And, but he found out at the end of those 4 years, all he got was a BS in French and in ecology. And it kind of left him, I think, a little troubled to realize that these practical skills he was hoping for, he hadn't got them. And so what's also really mysterious about this period is he says he spent a lot of time in France, but we cannot find any photos of Sam in France. And so, we're really wondering what he was doing in France in terms of his bike ferry aspirations.
Yeah, so we imagine that like the head bike ferry is actually Leo Blondell right here, and we can only imagine that he trains future bike ferries like this guy, or this lady, or this little future ferry right here. And so Sam probably thought that he could be here, right? But if we're going to be honest, though, there's really only one person who could actually be there, and that's obviously this guy, right? Which now, of course, ruins Sam's chances of being a bike ferry. And so, of course, then he decides to go back to Vermont and try making his hand at the other part of his degree, right, which is getting the BS in ecology. And so, of course, when he was trying to find a job during the recession, the only type of job that is out there in ecology in Vermont is electrofishing, which is really interesting because so you can see here that he's sort of like zaps lakes and collects fish doing research for the government, according to him. And he also said he was really good at electrofishing, which actually makes sense because it's like the perfect job to apply his previous skills and knowledge. So like instead of popping off a customer for a lake feed, he could pop up a few fish for living in their natural habitat or something like that. And he also gets to dress up every day with wildly baggy pants like his idol Leo Blondell without anybody raising an eyebrow. So he did this for a while before he realized that there's actually no money in ecology. And especially now that he has a girlfriend that he really liked, he was kind of in a pickle, right? And so then he dawned on his Ace Ventura get up to figure out what he had to do to become successful again. And And so what did he turn to?
This was a game changer because Sam, he was a part of the modern economy and he needed to do something to really make the best out of the modern economy. And so what he did is he started a website. He worked for Amazon, he worked for eBay, so he might as well work for samfixit.com. And in samfixit.com, what he created is a brand where you can restore, repair, and consult. And because this is the modern economy, what it focused on was the most modern thing that was out there, typewriters. And Sam clearly had a very brilliant scheme for becoming rich. The base rate is 39 per hour, ribbon replacement 10, bend frame repair, you get it. And so you can see here that he has some serious aspirations. However, being from Minnesota and from Vermont, I think it struck him, it was very, very tough for him when he realized that typewriters weren't a thing anymore. And computers had arrived, iPad, iPhone. And I think that was just a really, really challenging time for Sam. And so he decided to find another way to get rich or die trying.
Yeah, so basically defeated and rejected, and he clearly made the only thing that gave his life story, or like makes sense within his life story right now, is to basically take the GRE and come to Harvard where he can pursue his passions and obsessions, which is then obviously to be a mechanic. So, without further ado, here's Sam.
Wow. that was really memorable. I'm going to have nightmares about it forever. So the title of my talk is A Little Bird Told Me. And I'm going to be talking about language. So language, to define for the purposes of this talk, is variation around a theme. So a language would be like if you say, here's something that is a problem, and you can tell them in specific if it's a big problem or a small problem or a medium problem. I can contrast language with something like a primal scream, which is more of a binary, where you have either it's a scream or no scream. So either there's a problem or there's no problem. So that's how I'm defining language for the purposes of this discussion. So I want you to keep that in mind as you're listening to the talk. And I'll start with an example of another species that also has a language, the undergrad. So when undergrads are confronted with certain kinds of stimuli, I should turn on the light. There. So when undergrads are confronted with certain kinds of stimuli, they respond with their language. So when undergrads are confronted with a fast-moving predator, they have a neat call that they make that alerts the other undergrads of the fast-moving predator so that they can display the classic undergrad behavior, which is flee. Now, so that's one kind of example of an undergrad call. Another example of an undergrad call is to a stopped predator. Now this is an example of where you might get more than just a binary, because this is a sitting predator that is a low threat. So the undergrad can respond with a low threat response. And they don't have to do anything. They recognize this because it's their language. Now, if you see a predator if the undergrad sees a predator that's a high threat, they have another interesting response. They issue a mobbing call, and they go and they mob the high threat predator. So, before I go any further, I'll explain the mobbing response a little, because it might seem counterintuitive. So when a predator is considered a high threat, it's common in different species that work in 3D environments, in 3D systems like birds and fish. They will do things to try and visually confuse the predator. And you can think about this in terms of if you're a predator and you're trying to catch something, you can think about it like trying to hit a tennis ball. The tennis ball is coming at you in 3D, and you need to hit the tennis ball. And that's easy when there's one tennis ball. You'd probably hit it. But if there are 3 tennis balls and they're mobbing you like this, then you're probably not going to hit any of the tennis balls. And that's the strategy behind this. You can see it in fish schooling and also in birds. They will mob a predator, confuse it, and the predator will usually give up. So that brings me to the first paper I'm going to discuss. This is Allometry of Alarm Calls. Black-capped chickadees encode information about predator size. So this is a black-capped chickadee, and the birds cited in this paper, you're going to see they'll all be black-capped chickadees. Florian thought a black-capped chickadee was a brand of cigarette, so I thought I would just clarify here. So black-capped chickadees have 2 different types of alarm call. The first one, that's the seat alarm call. It's a very high-pitched and short alarm call, like that. And it signifies a fast-moving predator, and the signal is that the chickadee should run away. So when chickadees hear the seat alarm call, they know they're supposed to run away. The second type of alarm call is a mobbing alarm call, and that's for a predator that's considered a threat, but it's not moving. So the chickadees respond by mobbing the predator, as I described earlier. So the mobbing alarm call is the classic chickadee call that you've probably all heard. Right? So when chickadees make that call, other chickadees are alerted to join the mob and mob the predator. So there are different levels of threat as far as chickadee predators are concerned. And this is another thing that's going to be counterintuitive. When the chickadees are presented with a small predator, like a pygmy owl, they consider it a greater threat because pygmy owls and chickadees both are similar sizes. So a pygmy owl and a chickadee they have the same level of maneuverability. The chickadee has small turning radius. The pygmy owl has just as small a turning radius. So the pygmy owl can catch the chickadee in flight. The chickadee doesn't think that a great horned owl or any other big bird is such a big threat because the chickadee can outturn the big bird. So the question that the authors of this paper wanted to ask is, because both these predators would be examples of predators that chickadees would mob. So what the question that the authors wanted to ask is, do the chickadees have a difference in how much they care, and do they vocalize this? So in other words, might they have a different sort of alarm call for a small predator versus a large predator? So in order to measure this, they presented chickadees with different sizes of predators. So they presented wild chickadees in a controlled environment, but still a wild environment, with a small predator, in this case a pygmy owl, and they got a call like this. And you can see it's composed of 2 parts. This part, which is the, and then this part, the. And they call these D nodes. And the interesting thing that they found was when they presented the chickadees with a large predator, they got fewer D nodes in the call. So it was more like. So they found that there was some kind of a code or language, for our purposes, to encode the difference between small predators and large predators. But they didn't stop there. They presented chickadees with a whole array of different sizes of predators, and they found a linear correlation between predator body length, so predator size, because remember, body length equals turning radius equals threat. Smaller turning radius, smaller predator, bigger threat. So they add more Ds to the end of their call. So very small birds, when presented to chickadees, the chickadees would have a longer call. They also did a control, which is a small bird that was a non-threat. just to confirm that that the calls were in response to threat and not to size. So they wanted to confirm that these weren't just calls saying that this is what they were doing. These were calls that were understood as well, because a language has to be understood as well as vocalized. So what they did was they recorded calls for large predators and in response to small predators. And then they would play them back to other chickadees that hadn't made the calls in the first place. So when they played back a call that was in response to a small predator, they found that the birds that these calls were played to would make their own calls at a greater rate than if they were played back the large predator call. So in other words, the higher the threat, the more a bird presented with this language would respond. And so it's like a game of telephone. It serves to amplify itself, just the way a language should. And in addition, they found that the chickadees that heard these calls would follow instructions. So when they heard a call that was about a small predator, they were more likely to approach the speaker from which the call was emanating. So than if they heard a call about a large predator. So they clearly found, based on these results and the previous results, that the chickadee language encodes a certain level of specificity in terms of a spectrum of different levels of threat, and it's understood that way. So the question that this raises is all this information floating around in the forest, and it's free because it's being vocalized. So is anyone else listening? So that brings us to the second paper I'm going to discuss. Nuthatches eavesdrop on variations in heterospecific chickadee mobbing alarm calls. So this is a red-breasted nuthatch, and this is the subject of this paper. Now, nuthatches are the ideal subject. They wanted to, the researchers, Templeton and Green, wanted to understand whether nuthatches understand chickadee calls. So in other words, a cross-species thing. And the reason they picked the red-breasted nuthatch is because red-breasted nuthatches are the same size as chickadees. So they would have the same level of threat from the same size predator. And red-breasted nuthatches are known to co-flock with chickadees. So they have some experience of being around chickadee calls. They have a reason to understand chickadee calls. So it is known that heterospecific listening happens. For example, in Africa, the superb starling has different calls for a threat on the ground versus a threat in the air. And the superb starling call, it's not considered to be encoding a second level of information because there's no spectrum. It's either down or up. And it turns out that the vervet monkey can hear and distinguish between these two calls because they're very different, and they know which way to look. For a call that alerts to something in the air, the vervet monkey will look up, and for a call that alerts them to something on the ground, they'll look down. And they can understand this. But Templeton and Green wanted to know about a more fine-grained variation in language as we define it. So what they did was they played back chickadee mobbing alarm calls out of a hidden speaker, and they observed the behavior of red-breasted nuthatch pairs as they flew toward the speaker or away from the speaker to examine their mobbing response. And so what they found was when they played back a small predator call, in other words, a call that chickadees made about a small predator threat, saying to mob the predator, the nuthatches would actually exhibit a mobbing behavior. So they would hear a nuthatch would hear a chickadee call and exhibit a mobbing behavior where they would move toward where the call was coming from. And they would exhibit this mobbing behavior to a lesser extent with a lesser threat call. So in other words, the call with more D notes, the one that denotes a small predator, the nuthatch would approach the speaker more closely than when they heard a call about a large predator. They also found that the percentage of speaker approaches for the nuthatch in response to chickadee's small predator calls was higher than for large predator calls. So we're seeing, and then even higher for large predator calls than for the non-threat call. So we're seeing that the nuthatches can respond and understand the level of specificity in chickadee calls required to call this language. And I'd like to point out that the difference between these two trials, between the large predator call and the small predator call, in terms of how close the nuthatch approached the speaker, they were able to get a really good p-value for these experiments. These are really statistically significant for an ecology, a field ecology experiment. I mean, these are wild animals. And this is one of the things that really blew me away about this paper. These are wild animals in the field being observed, and they were able to get this kind of significant difference between two trials. So I thought that was kind of an amazing result. They also decided that they were going to test nuthatch stress response to chickadee mobbing calls. So they played back large predator and small predator chickadee calls and the control, and they found that they had two metrics they could measure for stress level in nuthatches. They measured the amount that nuthatches vocalize and the amount that nuthatches do this behavior called a wing flick, which is basically what it sounds like. The nuthatch will flick its wings in response to a stressor. So they found more wing flicks when nuthatches were exposed to a small predator noise versus a large predator versus a control. And the same thing, nuthatches became very noisy when they were exposed to a small predator noise, the chickadee noise about a small predator, that is, versus when they heard the chickadee call in response to a large predator and the control. So the conclusion here is clear. Nuthatches can understand chickadee language. And not just in terms of up or down, yes or no, but in terms of a spectrum of different threat levels. So the conclusions to both papers, I think, are best taken together. The first one is obviously that chickadee language encodes a large bandwidth. It's not even a binary or a trinary. As I showed you in the graph where they tested the chickadees with multiple different predators, they vocalize differently for everything, and they end up with a spectrum. And they also, and obviously the conclusion for the second paper is that this spectrum is picked up by another species, which is quite remarkable. So both these studies were field studies. And one was slightly more controlled than the other. But field studies bring with them advantages and disadvantages. So obviously, the advantages are that they used real animals, and there was no lab-introduced bias or error in the same way you would get if you were doing this on mice in a maze. And by the standards of an ecology experiment, these experiments were very well controlled and amazingly statistically robust, even for just behavior experiments in a lab. I think the results that they were able to get were amazingly significant. But I do have some criticisms about this first. The behavior that chickadees and nuthatches exhibit when they mob a predator is more likely to occur in certain habitats than in others. So if the nuthatch or chickadee is in an area that it cares about, like a breeding ground or someplace with food, they're more likely to mob a predator than run away. And the authors didn't really address this concern. Another concern is that when they played back the calls of nuthatches, they did only use a large predator and small predator call. I think they could have put in a medium predator call and not too much cost to themselves. And I don't know why they didn't do this. But there are also some future directions and unanswered questions that the research brings up. By the definition that I gave you at the start of my talk, this is a language, right? It encodes for variations around a theme. But I think an interesting question is this learned or innate? So there are easy experiments you could conduct to figure this out. You could isolate a chickadee or a nuthatch from birth and then raise it and play it some chickadee noises and see if it understands and goes and mobs the speaker the same way it should. And then another thing that might also be interesting is to take find a nuthatch or chickadee that does not co-flock with, a nuthatch that does not co-flock with chickadees, and see if this nuthatch responds the same way to chickadee calls. So I think both these can be interesting things to do. And I think it's also not really well answered whether this is whether the information encoded is about risk or size of the predator. Because remember I said they used a non-threat as a control, and that kind of tells you it's about risk and not size. But I think it would be really interesting to try like an artificially large owl or something and see if the chickadees respond any differently. What the authors are doing now is they've built a robotic owl, and they're testing this owl with different behaviors to see if they can get the chickadees to respond differently to the small owl acting more like a predator, or a big owl acting more like a predator. So something along these lines, to see if they can separate the risk of the predator and the size of the predator. So with that, I'd like to thank my coaches, Florian and Catherine. Matt raised his hand first.
What's the second bird called? I forget.
Red-breasted nuthatch.
Nuthatch. For that experiment, presumably because the chickadees, were there chickadees around there in that experiment?
There were not.
Oh,
They found nuthatches that were not around chickadees. It's not known whether they had co-flocked with chickadees at some point in the past. I mean, this is a field study, so again, it's poorly controlled, and it would be difficult to really rule out that there are chickadees here. But I don't. They didn't. They said that there weren't, but there could be, obviously, because it's ecology. Yeah, Devin.
So in both of these cases, the smaller predator call was the one with more Ds and the one that got more of a response. Is it possible that it's just more Ds, more response, not because they understand the language, but just because they're more likely to hear it?
That could be. But they do say that they controlled for this kind of thing. I mean, they played about a minute-long segment of the call, each call. So, and they tried to get tapes that had the same amount of the same number of calls throughout. So, not necessarily, they played them for the same duration, but I guess during that time, the one with more Ds would be slightly longer. But again, if you look at the number of seconds that the call lasts, the call with more Ds is only about a quarter of a second longer than the call with fewer Ds. So the amount of time on versus time off isn't that big of a difference.
But do they repeat or do they just see which ones?
They will repeat. But again, the researchers tried to control for this, in that they would play a tape with a natural series of calls. And they picked tapes where they had the same number of calls with more Ds or calls with fewer Ds, so that they could remove this variable. Ryan?
I was wondering, in terms of understanding the language, how important do you think, or they think, is the spacing between the D notes? Like, can you spread it out and still have the same amount of D notes? And will they understand? Do they at all kind of play around with it to the relative timing?
Like remixing calls?
Yeah, like DJ Bird song.
No, they didn't do any of that. And I don't know what would happen if they did. I do think it's interesting. A lot of times bird calls do this, where if you get more of these extra notes at the end, it means the same thing but with more emphasis. White-throated sparrow mating calls work the same way. If the white-throated sparrow really wants to mate, it will add a lot more notes at the end, versus if it doesn't really care, it will only put one or two. But no one, to my knowledge, has ever added space in between the notes to see what happens. Eric?
So, my understanding of it was that chickadees, actually songbirds, were contritial, so that the seat and certain elements of the chickadee thing are innate, but there's structural variations around the different syllables that are subtle that are learned, and therefore region. Did anybody comment on, like, red breast and patches having regional variations in how they associate with chickadees, and maybe the level of their understanding of chickadees, or like is it one of those things where it's like maybe they have common levels, you might not have, but like where a chickadee and a red breast sparrow, if they're from the same region, are going to understand each other regardless of where overall the world is from.
That's a good point. They did comment on region specificity in the context of they eliminated it as a variable because they used nuthatches and chickadees from the same region. And there is this notion of regional dialect for birds, it's true. But they didn't try to mix it up to gain any knowledge. And that would be an interesting future direction as well. Yeah?
So, I guess two questions comes to mind. The first question is whether you have to learn who's a threat or innate. And the second one is, you would think that mobbing behavior should depend on your knowledge of the density of small birds around you. Like if there's just one of you and you hear a mobbing call and you mob the object, this is sort of suicidal. And so I just wondered if you knew anything about either of those things.
Well, I know that chickadees are commonly in flocks of 2 to 5. 2 is good, 5 is better. They're not found very often in ones, as far as I know. So I don't think it matters from a fitness perspective, because the amount of times a chickadee is solitary are very few.
Okay?
Does that answer your question?
Yeah. And do we know anything about whether their knowledge about, so you showed an example of them knowing the difference between a predator and a non-predator.
Yes.
Is that learned or innate? Do we know?
Knowing the difference between a predator or a non-predator, as far as actually knowing the difference, or as far as the
Not worrying about the song, just knowing the difference. Like, am I going to get eaten or not?
I don't know.
Okay.
It may be known, but I don't know. But I can find out. Anyone else?